India is poised to become a leadership economy pretty soon, but that's bringing along with it a lot of problems. You have inequality, you have poverty, you have accidents, you have diseases. Talking of disease, did you realize TB in India actually kills 2 people per minute? Now let's just step back and try and understand what is one of the biggest causes of TB. It's just rampant spitting everywhere. You've seen it all over the place. And more than anything else, if you look at India specifically, culture of being clean, but only in my private space. In public space, I couldn't care less. Even slum dwellers, for that matter, end up taking a bath every day. They end up cleaning their homes. And then what do? They take all the garbage and then go out to the other side of the road and drop it off there. And not just slum dwellers. I've heard of people who stop their cars at Mahim Causeway so that they can just drop off litter. Now, people have got so used to doing this that it really doesn't matter anymore, More than anything else, if you look at weakening infrastructure, which is another big problem. For a train service that actually runs more than 2,000 trains a day, even those people find it very, very difficult to keep people like us off the tracks. Now, the conventional way of solving all of this has been generate awareness of the problem, educate me about the problem, and then I'll listen to you. But people do that, they generate awareness, they educate people about the problem, and yet what happens? We continue to do what we do. Not just in social problems. Even when you're looking at life and death situations, people find it really, really hard to change their behavior. Now, how many of us in this room don't know that smoking is bad and it could kill us? Yet, we continue to smoke. Johns Hopkins conducted a study among 20,000 people who had just recently undergone a bypass surgery, and they tracked them for 2 years. How many of those 20,000 people do you think actually changed their lifestyle? A mere 1 in 9. For something that is as near death as an experience as bypass surgery, where you make promises to yourself that, hey, I'm going to get rid of that burger. I'm not going to smoke anymore. I've kicked the bottle. In spite of all that being such a near-death experience, people still continue to do what they do. Even when it comes to being fit, 85% of the people who join a gym leave within the first 6 months. Because of which, I ended up taking a 3-month membership, and I still didn't use all of it myself. But if you look at it, why is something like this happening? I mean, why can't people do what is good for them? Why can't we do what is good for us? If you look at all of these societal problems and then cut off all the frills and look at them at a very, very fundamental level, these are actually behavioral problems. Your behavior is mostly driven by a non-conscious. In fact, all of our behavior is driven by a non-conscious. And by consciously making me aware of something, you can only do so much. So people keep doing all that, and that's what we keep saying, is that awareness is overrated. There is nothing that is happening. You can't make me aware of something and try and change my behavior. That just doesn't really work. It's about trying to get people to non-consciously react to stimuli, rather than making them consciously aware of something. Now, how do you go about doing that? If you look at the brain, typically, you realize that our brain, or the human brain, is wired like the internet. So it makes several connections across various regions of the brain to trigger specific behavior. So our brain sees everything and stores it in the non-conscious memory on the basis of importance, on the basis of significance, and on the basis of meaning. So whenever we get any new stimulus, it is this non-conscious part of the brain that actually picks up this stimulus. And then it decides whether to depress it, let it remain in the non-conscious, or actually activate it and send it into your conscious. Now, if we had to look at all the details, and if we decided to remember every little detail of whatever we saw, all that is around you, your brains will be really overloaded. Now, because we have limited attention, what you'll do is only concentrate on the key details of the scene, which is me right now, while all of this goes into your non-conscious memory. And it gets stored over there as a schema, a very relevant schema for future reference. Now, you and I can't have access to this memory at our wills, but it just gets triggered when you see something relevant. So if you go to your school for a reunion, there are these flood of memories that kind of come flowing in. You don't have will on what comes to you, what kind of gets onto it, but all your school memories, all your experiences are stored in the non-conscious brain, and they get triggered whenever we see something relevant. So if you have to understand natural behavior, you need new methods to research natural behavior. You need to have learnings from cognitive neurology. You need to have learnings from behavioral economics. Asking people why they do what they do has proven to be very, very ineffective in actually predicting future behavior. Now, how do you understand what is non-conscious behavior? How can we identify what is non-conscious behavior? Well, everyone who's been in Bombay has been stopped on traffic signals by beggars, right? Everyone? So here's my question. Let's say the third lady on the fourth row. Hi. Yeah, yourself. Yeah. If you had 10 rupees to spare, which of these beggars would you give the money to? The second? Okay. Anyone else? How many would give the money to number 2? Let's have show of hands. A few. How many would give the money to number 3? Okay, still a few. But let me try to say that when we spoke to people and asked them, most of the people, a majority of the people answered that they would give the money to the mother. Now, why is that? I mean, why is everyone trying to give money to the mother? And we know it's because of this little prop called the empty milk bottle. While you might not consciously notice the empty milk bottle, what your brain has done is it's seen the empty milk bottle and it's triggering a lot of non-conscious memories around hardship, around deprivation, around poverty, around mothers. Everything kind of comes to you. And that is why you give them the money. And that's what we say is that your non-conscious brain is a sucker for all these tactics. And your conscious brain only follows in its act. So if I ask you, why did you give the money to this person? You're going to say, no, she was crying so much. Oh God, her baby was wailing. I just couldn't see her that way. And that is what your conscious brain tells your non-conscious brain. But in fact, it's your non-conscious brain telling your conscious brain to give you money. And that's what we keep saying is that conscious drives opinion. But your non-conscious is actually the one that actually drives behavior. Now, coming back to social problems, when you're looking at big societal problems, I was just kind of looking at statistics of what causes the major number of deaths in Bombay. You have road accidents, AIDS, malaria, swine flu. If you look at this, going back to the whole idea of societal problems, they are not societal problems, they are all behavioral problems. You're not having safe sex, that's why you're getting AIDS. You're not wearing your mask or getting tested, that's why you're getting swine flu, and you're actually dying because of it. But what is most surprising is that if you look at people crossing the tracks, more number of people actually lose their lives when they're crossing the tracks than AIDS, swine flu, malaria, road accidents, all put together. This is a big societal problem, and this is a big behavioral problem. Now, how do you solve this thing? How do you reduce deaths that happen on the tracks? To intricately understand this problem of trespassing, what we've done is we've actually spent close to 6 months mingling with the trespassers, walking along with them, crossing the tracks along with them, to study their behavior. And how do you kind of understand why do trespassers do what they do? And why do people die? And that is what we're trying to answer over here. If you look at trespassing specifically, trespassing is inevitable in Bombay. This is probably the only city in the entire world that has a huge population that lives by the tracks, and they call the tracks home. So there are new trespassers who learn the rules of the track from more experienced trespassers. And at some time, they familiarize themselves with the tracks. And because they're familiarizing themselves with the tracks, it just so happens that it becomes default behavior. It becomes very, very default action. Even children learn from them. And this is the way it's actually happening right now. And this non-conscious urge to cross the track, this non-conscious urge to stick to default behavior is what gets people to break these walls that the railways build up. The railways is trying its best to kind of, get that on, but this is what gets people to break these walls, defy authorities, and reclaim their ownership over the tracks. You might say that everyone is overconfident, and say that, hey, this guy is very overconfident of his ability. And this overconfidence happens because of this ingrained behavior. As human beings, all of us are genetically wired with overconfidence. So unless we are clinically depressed, all of us feel overconfident about our abilities. And that's why we think we are better drivers than everyone else. That's why we think that if we launch a business or we start a business, we can kind of get it on to success. But, overconfidence is not the only reason why deaths actually happen on the tracks. There are two more big reasons. One is deficiencies in visual processing of the human brain. And two is irrational activity that happens in the mind of the trespasser or in the brain of the trespasser. Now, these two combined with this overconfidence, that is your biggest reason as to why deaths happen. This is a very tragic way to die, being cut in two pieces, coming down under the train and being cut in two pieces. And it's saddening because this is a register that's kept at every station master's office, and they unwillingly record deaths after deaths after deaths after deaths. Now, why is this? Why can't we kind of get down and understand what is right for us? Why can't we do what is good for us? If you look at current thinking, right? Everyone is focused on, don't get the people on the tracks, because if you get them on the tracks, they're going to die. And not just these signs over here, which we've taken from all over the world, but you have human chains, you have volunteers, you have fines that kind of get done by the Indian Railways. But the minute you take them all off, the deaths start happening again. And that is a sad thing to do. We need a new approach. So new thinking is that wherever it's impossible to stop people from trespassing. In fact, when we've been on the tracks, we've counted 25 to 45 people per minute crossing the tracks. We've just stood over there and just counted people. And that translates into like 30,000 foot crossings every day. And I'm talking about one point. I'm not talking all over Bombay. Now, when you have so many things that are happening, when you have so many people that are crossing the tracks all over Bombay, there's only so much that you can do with force. There's only so much that you can do with fines. So wherever it's impossible for people to trespass, what we need to do is stop deaths from happening. We need to keep them safe on the tracks. In other words, how can you skew their decisions without infringing on their freedom of choice? And that is the idea. So if you look at this perspective on keeping the trespassers that's safe when they are on the tracks, saving lives takes a whole new meaning altogether. So if you want to keep the trespasser safe on the tracks, and if you want to save his life, what we need to do is A, break this overconfidence in ability when people are just about entering the tracks. And B, what we also need to do is tackle these deficiencies in visual processing, tackle these irrational activities that happen in the trespasser's brain, so that he can get better judgment, so that he can remain alert while he's on the tracks. While people are saying that they are overconfident, what we saw is that everyone does anything while you're on the tracks to avoid getting hit by the train. So the trespasser will do anything to avoid getting hit by the train. Fear is such a large, such a dominant non-conscious memory that is at the trespasser's mind when he's on the tracks. And this is what directs their all behavior. So there is this fear that is there on people's tracks. We have been caught in the middle of the tracks with trains hurtling on both sides. And there was this old lady who was holding on to my arm for dear life. And she was scared. She was very, very scared. Now, how can I take this fear and emotionally transfer it to the other trespassers, so that they become conscious when they become cautious when they are getting onto the tracks, and if it can break that overconfidence in ability. So this is what we did when people are just entering the tracks. We said, let's break that overconfidence in ability. Let's use repetition, because the minute any stimulus is repeated, your brain sees that much better. Let's use the face to denote emotions. Because as we've evolved over the ages, as human beings, we look upon others' faces to understand what they are feeling. If no one is interested, I can easily tell if no one is interested. And that is the reason when there is this brilliant quote which says, that is why we see faces in clouds and not clouds in faces. So as human beings, we are used to kind of looking at other people's faces to try and understand what they're feeling. And this is what we did to emotionally transfer the fear of being on the tracks to just when they kind of get into the tracks. Another thing that we realized is that while we were sitting down and actually watching people cross tracks, we noticed this interesting thing. Is if I'm crossing the tracks and if the train is kind of coming from there, the minute a trespasser sees the train, he starts running. And you're like, hey, why is this happening? Why can't they stop when they see the train? And then you realize that this is classic flight response. As human beings, whenever you are confronted with danger, your immediate instinctive action is to either fight it or flight from it. But what the trespasser does is, in his flight, he moves on to the other track. And he hasn't noticed the train that's coming on from that side. And that goes and he gets hit by that train. So we said, let's look a little bit more, let's see what we're finding. And we noticed a very interesting discrepancy. Is that when the trespasser was crossing and the train was at a certain distance, if it didn't honk, the trespasser would just cross. But at that same distance, if the train honked, the trespasser would stop. So the train's honk, more than serving as a warning signal, it seemed to completely eliminate this flight response of the trespasser. So what did we do? We just institutionalized this honking. So we installed whistle boards at 120 meters from the trespassing point. And that seemed to be this magical distance on which, hearing the honk, trespassers stopped. If you honk earlier than 120 meters, you're far from being dangerous. Saying, "Arey, it's there, why are you honking now? I can cross." But if you honk a little later than 120 meters, the trespasser is already committed to crossing the tracks. And he doesn't mind if the train is coming, it's only kind of going to go in faster. So this is how we broke the flight response of the trespassers when they're getting onto the tracks. Now, when he's on the tracks, how do you make him more alert? How do you make him more attentive to the oncoming train? There is one research that was done by Stanford University on music and cognitive ability of the brain. And they uncovered one very interesting finding. It said that brain activity was at its peak at a time of silence in between two musical movements, in between two musical notes. So, at the time when nothing was happening. And it was at this time of silence that the brain was most alert. So what we did is we took learnings from this little research and we recommended a staccato honk, which has been being implemented in Central Railways as a part of the thing. So we said, let's break the horn. Let's get the motorman to break the honk, because you try it out. Next time when you're kind of driving out, when you drive out and when you see people crossing, instead of just going ping, go ping, 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 and see how people react. Immediately, that silence in between the two notes automatically makes people more alert. So the minute you break the motorman's honk, the trespasser becomes more alert, and then he sees, oh yeah, there's a train coming, let me not cross. And this is what we did to make the trespasser a little more alert on the tracks. Now, we've talked about deficiencies in visual processing, and this is a screenshot from what you end up calling the Leibowitz Principle, which basically says that we as human beings, or the human brain, is not designed to judge the size and speed of large objects. So, we think that large objects are traveling at a much slower speed than smaller objects at the same speed. We've all encountered that. You sit in a Maruti 800 and go at 100 kilometers per hour. You're like, hey, stop, you're going too fast. But the minute you sit in a big bus, you go at 100 kilometers per hour, you're like, hey man, this is going so slow. And that is the way it is. We've always seen that. We know about that. And that is what the trespasser, when he's crossing, he thinks the train is too far away, that he can actually cross. But then he realizes his mistake when he sees that the train is so close. And then that results in panic, and then he freezes, and then that's instant death. And that's how the people get actually cut in two pieces. Now, how do you tackle these visual deficiencies that exist in the brain? How can you give the trespasser more judgment? How can you make him evaluate the speed of the train better? And what we did is we gave him reference points on the tracks. So we just painted the yellow lines on the tracks. So as the train comes to you, the yellow lines keep disappearing under the train. The faster the yellow lines keep disappearing under the train, you realize that the train is fast. The slower the yellow lines keep disappearing under the train, you realize it's safe to cross. And this is how we kind of gave him better efficiency, better evaluation of what the train speed is. You know, it's really tough putting price and statistics on saving lives. But the success of this neuroscience approach has been tremendous. We've been able to get deaths down by over 60%. And these deaths affect everyone. Yeah, it's very reassuring, it's very heartening, you know, and that's the way it is. But you realize that these deaths actually affect everyone. Not just the trespasser, but his family, whom he's going home to. The motorman gets 2 days leave because he has trauma, because there's someone who's come under his thing and he's inadvertently plowed him down for no fault of his. The station master has to unwillingly record each death. You know, and that's the thing, and his register is getting filled up. These deaths affect everyone. So by saving lives, what these solutions have done is not just save the trespasser's life, but they've saved his family. They've saved his child who's waiting for him at home. And I think that's the biggest reward of working on this particular project. Just to conclude, if there are two big things that kind of come out. One is that if you have a big behavioral problem, you don't need fancy solutions. You don't need huge budgets. You don't need heavy resources to solve that particular problem. What you need is a new fundamental approach based on science. And that is your big idea. And more than anything else, what these solutions have shown us is that it is possible for us to change other people's behavior without them actually being aware that we are changing their behavior. Now, that is a world I want you to imagine as you walk out of here. Thank you.